They called it cursed, until she opened the door and changed everything forever. Alma Prescott, 20 years old and the daughter of a blacksmith, was left destitute in the New Mexico Territory of 1884 after her father's lungs finally gave out to the coal dust. With no family, no money, and no plan, she had only her father's small forging hammer and the $1.50 in a cloth pouch that was her inheritance. And with one of those dollars, she filed a claim on an adobe house at the edge of the town of Trinidad Springs, a place no one would enter because 3 of its owners had died within its thick clay walls. But what nobody in that sun-bleached town knew was that behind a long sealed door was not a curse, but a trust. It was a secret kept by the earth and the silence, waiting for a hand steady enough to uncover it, and what it held would change her life, and the town, forever. Settle in close with us, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight as we tell her story. Alma had grown up in the rhythmic world of fire and iron, a place of clean, ringing sounds and the sharp smell of quenching steel. Her father, Elias Prescott, was a man built of the same sturdy material he worked. He had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, a widower with a baby daughter, seeking dry air and a place to build a life from the bedrock of his craft. He was not a large man, but his hands were maps of his trade, calloused and sure, and he moved with an economy of motion that Alma learned to mimic. From the time she was old enough to stand on a stool, she was in the smithy. She learned the names of the tools not as words, but as shapes in her hand. The flat peen hammer for drawing out, the ball peen for riveting, the cross peen for spreading. She learned the colors of the fire, the cherry red of bending heat, the bright yellow of forging temperature, and the brilliant, almost white heat of a forge weld. Her father never treated her as a girl, only as an apprentice. "Watch the metal, not the hammer," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the clang of his work. "The steel will tell you when it's ready to move. You just have to listen." He taught her more than craft. He taught her a way of seeing. He showed her how to look at a broken wagon wheel not as a ruin, but as a collection of sound parts and a single point of failure. He taught her to see the true steel beneath a layer of rust, to understand that decay was often just a surface problem, and that a little work with a wire brush and some oil could reveal the strength that was always there. Her most treasured possession was a small hammer he had forged for her when she turned 12. It was perfectly balanced, with a smooth, dark hickory handle worn to a polish by her own grip, and a head of hardened steel whose face she kept dressed and clean. It was a tool for finer work, for shaping hooks and hinges, and it felt like an extension of her own arm. It was the object that held the weight of her father's respect for her, a silent acknowledgement of her skill. They lived a quiet, contained life in the 2 rooms behind the forge, a life measured by the rising of the sun and the cooling of the day's last embers. It was a good life, and Alma assumed it would continue, that she would one day work beside her father as a partner, the sign above the door reading Prescott and Daughter. But the dust of the forge was a patient thief, and it had been stealing his breath for years, a little at a time, until one spring morning there was none left. The quiet that followed his death was heavier than any hammer blow. After the circuit preacher said his words and the few townsfolk who had depended on her father's work paid their respects, Alma was left alone with the silence of a cold forge. The debt came for her a week later in the form of Mr. Silas Sterling, the agent for the Territorial Land and Development Office. He was a man whose presence seemed to absorb the light from a room, dressed in a black wool suit ill-suited for the New Mexico sun, and a face that seemed permanently pinched in disapproval. He did not offer condolences. He unrolled a sheaf of papers on the clean-swept floor of the smithy, the same floor where she had learned to stand and work. He pointed a dry finger at the columns of figures: the loan for the smithy's equipment, the lien on the property for the lumber and adobe bricks, the accumulated interest. It was a language she did not understand, but the final sum was clear enough. There was nothing left. The forge, the tools, the small house, all of it belonged to the land office now. The cruelty of it was its lack of passion. It was not an act of malice, but of simple, unfeeling arithmetic. Mr. Sterling spoke in a monotone, explaining that the property would be auctioned. Her father's life's work, the anvil that had shaped her world, was now just an asset in a ledger. Alma did not argue. She did not plead or weep. The quiet endurance her father had taught her was a kind of armor. She looked at the man, at the papers, and she gave a single sharp nod. He seemed disappointed by her composure, as if a display of grief would have validated his power. "You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate," he said, rolling up the papers. Alma spent the rest of that day packing. It did not take long. She had few possessions of her own. She wrapped her father's straight razor and his whetstone in a piece of oiled leather. She folded her 2 spare dresses and a heavy wool blanket into a canvas satchel. The last thing she packed was her small forging hammer, its handle cool and familiar in her palm. She tucked it deep inside the satchel, the weight of it a small, solid anchor in a world that had come adrift. As the sun began to set, casting long, sharp shadows from the silent forge, she closed the door to the home she had always known and did not look back. She had $1.50, a blanket, and a hammer. And she had a destination in mind. Her journey was not one of great distance, but of profound displacement. She walked from the center of Trinidad Springs, where the mercantile and the land office and the saloon stood as solid, respectable structures of wood and fired brick, toward the dusty western fringe of the settlement. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the pale dirt of the street, and the air was thick with the alkaline smell of dust. Townspeople saw her. She saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes, the quick turn of a head, the sudden interest in a storefront window. They knew of her father's passing, and they knew what Mr. Sterling's visit to the forge must have meant. She was no longer Alma Prescott, the blacksmith's daughter, a fixture in the town's working life. She was now an orphan, a transient, a problem to be avoided. Their averted gazes were a kind of wall, and with each step, she felt her old life falling away behind her. The town grew sparser as she walked, the neat wooden houses giving way to smaller, humbler adobes, their clay walls the color of the earth they came from. Chickens scattered from her path, and a lean dog watched her pass with wary eyes from the shade of a tamarisk tree. She was heading for the last house, the one that sat apart from the others, where the sparse grassland began its slow, inexorable roll toward the distant, blue-smudged mountains. It was known simply as the Clay House, and it had been empty for 5 years. Superstition clung to it like the stubborn desert lichen on its northern wall. The first owner, a prospector, had been found dead in his cot, his heart having given out. The family who bought it next lost their young son to a fever within a month, and they fled, leaving most of their possessions behind. The last owner was a solitary trapper who had taken up residence one winter and was found frozen solid in his chair come the spring thaw. After that, no one would go near it. They said the house itself was a source of sorrow, that the very clay of its walls held a chill that seeped into the bones. Alma had heard the stories all her life, But she did not believe in cursed earth. She believed in what her father had taught her, to look at the structure of things. The house was a shelter. It had walls and a roof. The rest was just stories. She stopped before it, the silence broken only by the wind whispering through the dry stalks of shamisa and snakeweed that crowded its yard. It was small, a single square room with a lean-to kitchen, its adobe walls streaked and eroded by seasons of rain and sun. The wooden lintel above the door sagged, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. It looked weary, abandoned, but to Alma it looked like a possibility. It was a place to be. Before she would let herself touch the door, she turned and walked back to the land office. Mr. Sterling was at his desk, his paperwork arranged in severe, orderly stacks. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at being disturbed. "Yes?" She placed a single silver dollar on the polished wood of his desk. The coin seemed small and insignificant in the imposing room. "I want to file a claim," she said, her voice steady. "On the old clay house, the one at the edge of town." A slow, thin smile spread across Sterling's face. It was a smile of grim satisfaction, the look of a man confirming his low opinion of the world. He thought her a fool, taking on the one property no one wanted, a place of death and bad luck. "It's unregistered land, technically," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But the office oversees it. The filing fee is $1 for the paperwork." He slid a form across the desk. "No guarantee of title, sold as is, no refunds." He was enjoying this, getting her last dollar for a worthless, haunted ruin. Alma carefully printed her name, Alma Prescott, on the line. He blotted it, filed it away, and dropped a heavy, rust-pocked iron key on the desk. It landed with a dull thud. Alma picked it up. It was cold and solid in her hand. She had traded almost everything she had for this single piece of metal. She turned and walked out of the office, the key clutched in her fist, leaving Mr. Sterling to his smug certainty. She did not care what he thought. She had what she came for. She had a key to a door. The key turned in the lock with a grating shriek of rusted metal, and the heavy plank door swung inward on complaining leather hinges. A gust of trapped air, thick with the scent of dry clay, mouse droppings, and a deep, ancient stillness washed over her. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. A single room, perhaps 15 feet square, with a packed earth floor that was surprisingly level and smooth. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, fell in a single, sharp rectangle from the open doorway, illuminating the space in stark relief. Against the far wall stood a simple fireplace, its hearth cold and black. A rough-hewn table and a single three-legged stool were the only furniture. In one corner, a pile of dusty, moth-eaten blankets lay where the last occupant had left them. It was a space stripped to its barest essentials, shelter. But it was the wall to her left that held her attention. There, set between the main fireplace and the corner, was another door. It was smaller than the entrance, made of the same rough planks, but it was different. It was not just closed, it was sealed. A thick layer of dried adobe mud had been smeared along its edges, filling the gap between the door and its frame, a clear and deliberate act of concealment. Alma ran her fingers over the hardened clay. It was old, cracked like a dry riverbed. This was the room the stories whispered about, the place where the prospector had been found. The family who fled had never opened it, and the trapper who froze had likely paid it no mind. For years, it had remained shut. She spent the rest of that first day not on the sealed door, but on the main room. She worked with the methodical patience her father had taught her. She dragged the foul blankets outside and set them afire, the greasy smoke rising straight up into the still afternoon air. She used a bundle of stiff weeds as a broom, sweeping the floor clean of dust and debris. The rhythmic scrape and whisper, the first sound of life the house had heard in half a decade. She opened the wooden shutter on the single window, letting in a wash of late afternoon light. The glass was gone, but the opening faced east and would catch the morning sun. With each small act of labor, she was not just cleaning a space, she was claiming it. She was replacing the narrative of curses and death with the simple, irrefutable fact of her own presence, her own work. As dusk settled, she sat on the three-legged stool, eating a piece of hard bread she'd carried, and looked at the sealed door. It was not a threat. It was a question. And like any piece of stubborn, unyielding material, she knew it would give way to the right tools and a steady hand. The next morning, she began. From her satchel, she took her father's hammer and a small cold chisel she had tucked in beside it. She started at the top corner of the door, placing the sharp edge of the chisel against the hardened adobe seal and tapping it gently with the hammer. A small chip of dried mud fell away. Tap, tap, chip, tap, tap, chip. The sound was small but resonant in the quiet room. It was the sound of purpose. She worked her way down the side of the doorframe, a slow, painstaking process. The mud was as hard as rock in places, and she had to be careful not to damage the wooden jamb beneath. It was the kind of work she understood, a problem of material and force. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the light inside the small house shifted. Finally, she had cleared the entire perimeter. The door now sat loosely in its frame. It had no handle, only a small hole where a leather latch string might once have been. She put her fingers in the hole and pulled. The door resisted, swollen tight in its frame. She rocked it back and forth, putting her shoulder into it. And with a low groan of protesting wood, it swung inward into darkness. The air that spilled out was different from the rest of the house. It was not the scent of neglect, but of deep, undisturbed time. It was dry, cool, and carried a faint, sweet smell, like old paper and dried herbs. The room was small, no more than 8 feet by 8 feet, with no window. It was a storeroom, a pantry, nothing more. A collapsed wooden cot lay against one wall, its canvas rotted away. A few pottery shards were scattered on the floor. It felt anticlimactic, a sealed room holding only emptiness. She almost turned away, disappointed, but her father's voice echoed in her memory. Look at the structure. See what's really there. Her eyes scanned the room again, more slowly this time. The packed earth floor was mostly uniform, but in the corner, directly opposite the door, she saw it. A section of the floor, a rough square about 3 feet to a side, was a slightly different color, a paler shade of brown, and it was raised by no more than half an inch. It was a patch, a repair. But why repair a floor in a sealed room? Her heart began to beat a little faster. She fetched a rusted spade head she'd found in the yard and began to pry at the edge of the patch. The dried clay broke away, and underneath she saw not more earth, but the dark, straight edge of a wooden plank. She dug with her bare hands now, pulling away the dirt and clay until she had uncovered the edges of a crude trapdoor, its surface flush with the original floor. There was a small, inset iron ring, rusted and stiff. She hooked her fingers through it and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted, and beneath it was not a cellar, but a deep, dark cavity. and nestled inside that cavity was a heavy, iron-strapped wooden chest. The chest was made of dark, heavy mesquite wood, bound with straps of blackened iron. It was not large, but it took all of Alma's strength to heave it out of the hole and drag it into the main room, into the light. The lock was a heavy, intricate piece of Spanish ironwork, fused shut with a century of rust. There was no key. For anyone else, it would have been an impassable barrier. For Alma, it was a familiar problem. She took her chisel and her hammer, found the seam where the hasp met the body of the chest, and with a few sharp, precise blows, she sheared the rusted metal pins. The lock fell away with a clatter. She lifted the heavy lid. The first thing she saw was the soft, dull gleam of metal. The chest was filled nearly to the top with silver coins. They were not American dollars, but heavy Spanish pieces of 8, tarnished with age, their surfaces bearing the faded likeness of a long-dead king. She ran her hands through them, the coins cool and impossibly heavy, a cascade of silent history. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined, but beneath the coins, there was more. She carefully lifted them out, stacking them in neat piles on the floor, until she reached the bottom. There, wrapped in a swath of faded, brittle oilcloth, lay 2 objects. The first was a reliquary. It was about a foot long, crafted from a dark, polished wood she didn't recognize, and inlaid with intricate patterns of mother-of-pearl. A small, glass-covered window in its center protected a tiny, brown fragment of what looked like woolen cloth. It was an object of profound and patient devotion. The second object was a heavy roll of parchment, tied with a leather thong and sealed with a blob of dark red wax, brittle with age. She carefully broke the seal and unrolled the documents. The script was an elegant, unfamiliar Spanish. The ink faded to a rusty brown. Maps, boundaries, signatures, and official seals covered the pages. It was clearly a legal document of some kind, but its meaning was lost to her. At the very bottom of the chest, lying alone, was a thin book bound in worn leather. She opened it. The writing inside was not the florid Spanish of the grant, but a plain, careful script, written in English. It was a journal, and the first page read like a letter. My name is Brother Mateo de la Cruz. I am a lay brother of the Franciscan order. I built this small house with my own hands in the year of our Lord, 1789, on the lands of the mission of San Geronimo, which has now fallen to ruin. The Comanche raids have driven the priests away, and I am the last one here. I have hidden what I could save. The silver is the mission's tithe, meant for the building of a true church. The reliquary holds a piece of the cloak of St. Francis, our patron, and the documents are the king's grant, the deed given by the King of Spain to the church for all this valley, from the creek to the high mesas. It is God's land, and it is to be held in trust for the people who live and work upon it, not to be bought or sold for profit. I do not know what future this valley will see. I am old, and I feel a sickness in my chest. I will seal this room and trust in God's providence. If you are reading this, it means my own time has passed, but the trust remains. Use the silver for good works. Honor the relic, and see that the land is justly administered according to the grant. I have no one to pass this to, so I pass it to you, whoever you are. May God guide your hand. Brother Mateo de la Cruz, 1792. Alma sat back on her heels, the letter resting in her lap, the weight of 100 years of silence settling upon her. This house wasn't cursed. It was a sanctuary. It hadn't been a place of death, but a place of safekeeping. a trust left by a faithful man who had died alone, protecting the legacy of his community. The three men who had died here had not been victims of a malevolent spirit. They were simply men whose time had come, their lonely ends weaving a myth that had, by sheer chance, protected the very secret Brother Matteo had sought to hide. She looked from the letter to the stacks of silver, to the sacred reliquary, and to the land grant that described the very ground the town of Trinidad Springs was built upon. And she understood, with a certainty that was as solid as the anvil in her father's forge, that Mr. Silas Sterling and the Territorial Land and Development Office had been collecting rents and selling parcels of land they had never, not for a single day, legally owned. The first coin she spent felt like a betrayal and a promise all at once. She walked to the Gallo Mercantile the next morning, the heavy Spanish silver piece hidden in her palm. Mr. Gallo, a kind man with a perpetually worried expression, looked at the coin with curiosity. "That's an old one," he said, testing its weight. He gave her a fair price in trade, his eyes asking a question he was too polite to voice. Alma did not buy luxuries. She bought a sack of flour, beans, salt, a side of bacon, a new axe head, and 20 pounds of lime for making plaster. She was not just surviving now, she was building. The work on the house began in earnest. She used her new axe to clear the overgrown yard, the sharp thud of the blade a satisfying rhythm against the silence. She learned to mix adobe, a skill of instinct and feel, combining the dry earth with water and straw until it had the right consistency. She patched the cracks in the walls, her hands covered in the cool, wet clay, smoothing it into the wounds of the old house until they disappeared. The work was hard, her muscles aching at the end of each day. But it was honest work, and with every patch and every repair, the house felt more like her own. She knew she could not do it all alone. The roof needed new vigas, the heavy ceiling beams, and that was work beyond her strength. She took another silver coin and approached Jacobo, an old carpintero who lived in a small house down the lane. He was a man with a reputation for being gruff but honest, his skill with wood known throughout the valley. He was suspicious at first, his dark eyes appraising her, this young woman living alone in the cursed house. But the offer of fair pay for honest work was something he understood. He came the next day, and he not only helped her hoist the new logs into place, but he showed her how to notch them, how to secure them, how to read the grain of the wood. He spoke little, but his instruction was clear and patient. One afternoon, as they worked, Senora Gallo appeared at the door, a steaming pot of green chile stew in her hands. "A body can't live on beans and bacon alone," she said, her smile warm and genuine. It was the first act of unsolicited kindness Alma had received since her father's death, and it felt like a greater treasure than all the silver in the chest. Slowly, cautiously, the community was beginning to reach out a hand. The final piece was the most important. She took the reliquary and the land grant, wrapped them carefully in a clean cloth, and walked to the small adobe church that served the town. Father Miguel was an old man, his back bent and his eyesight failing, but his mind was sharp. He served the parish with a weary devotion, his faith a quiet, stubborn thing. He listened to her story patiently, his expression unreadable. When she unwrapped the objects on his simple wooden desk, a light came into his eyes. He picked up the reliquary, his gnarled fingers tracing the mother-of-pearl inlay. "San Geronimo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I have only read of it in the old diocesan records. It was thought lost forever." Then he turned to the land grant, using a magnifying glass to read the elegant Spanish script. He read for a long time, his lips moving silently. When he finally looked up at Alma, his eyes were clear and fierce. "This changes everything," he said. "This is not just a document. It is the truth of this place." The confrontation happened not with a shout, but with the quiet weight of authority. Father Miguel, holding the original land grant, walked into the territorial land office. Alma and Jacobo went with him, standing silently behind him as witnesses. Mr. Sterling was at his desk, and he greeted the priest with a condescending smile, assuming it was a request for a charitable donation. "Father," he began, "the office's resources are quite committed at present." Father Miguel did not speak. He simply unrolled the Spanish royal grant of 1789 on Sterling's meticulously organized desk. The ancient parchment, with its heavy seals and faded regal script, seemed to suck all the false importance out of the room. Sterling stared at it, his face slowly losing its color. "What is this nonsense?" he blustered, but his voice was thin. "This is an artifact? A curiosity? The United States government recognizes our territorial claims." "The United States government," Father Miguel said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of absolute conviction, "also recognizes the validity of prior Spanish and Mexican land grants under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This document grants this entire valley, from the creek to the mesas to the mission of San Geronimo, to be held in trust for its people. Your office, Mr. Sterling, has been acting as a landlord on property it has never owned. You are, to put it plainly, a fraud." Sterling began to protest, to talk of lawyers and territorial judges, but the priest held up a hand. "I have already sent a notarized copy by courier to the bishop in Santa Fe and to the territorial governor. The truth is now on record." The news spread through Trinidad Springs like a summer thunderstorm. It was spoken in hushed tones at the Mercantile, then in louder voices at the saloon. The people of the town, who had paid their rents and fees to Sterling for years, living under the assumption that the land beneath their homes belonged to a distant, faceless entity, were now told it was their own. The power in Trinidad Springs had shifted, not by force, but by the revelation of a long-buried truth. Alma became a quiet center of this new reality. She was not hailed as a hero. That was not the way of the town. Instead, her status was affirmed in small, practical acts of respect. A rancher, whose family had been paying rent on grazing land for 2 generations, left a quarter of a butchered calf on her doorstep. Senora Gallo refused any payment for her groceries, and people began to bring her work. A broken hinge, a bent plowshare, a branding iron that needed a new handle. She used some of the Spanish silver to buy a proper anvil and a good bellows from a freight hauler passing through, and she set up a small, open-air forge in the yard behind her house, just as her father's had been. The clear, ringing sound of her hammer on steel became a new rhythm for the town, a sound of restoration, of purpose. The clay house was no longer the cursed place on the edge of town. It was the blacksmith's house. It was Alma's house. Her life settled into a new pattern, one of work and quiet community. The morning smell of her coal fire, the daily ritual of sweeping the smithy, the small nod to Jacobo as he passed her door. These were the things that made a life. The house was no longer a burden or a ruin, but a warm, functional, and respected home, filled with the simple dignity of purpose she had earned. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, Alma stood in the doorway of her home. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the faint, lingering scent of her forge. A fire crackled in the hearth she had rebuilt, its warmth reaching her from across the room. On the simple wooden mantelpiece she had installed, 2 objects sat side by side, One was the reliquary of Brother Mateo, its dark wood polished to a soft sheen, a testament to a faith that had endured for a century in darkness. Beside it rested her father's small forging hammer, its hickory handle glowing in the firelight, a testament to a different kind of faith, a faith in craft, in strength, and in the enduring value of good work. She picked up the hammer, its familiar weight a comfort in her hand. She thought of her father's lesson, to see the true steel beneath the rust. He had been talking about metal, but he had taught her to see the world that way. She had looked at a cursed house and seen a shelter. She had looked at a broken town and found its true foundation. She thought of Brother Mateo, the solitary friar who had placed his hope in a stranger, trusting that someone would come who would understand the value of what he was protecting. She had never known him, but she felt a kinship with him, a shared understanding that the most important things are not those we own, but those we care for. Looking out at the scattered lights of Trinidad Springs, a town now secure in its own foundation, she felt a quiet sense of peace. Alma Prescott was 20 years old and had been left with nothing. She had spent $1 on a cursed adobe house at the edge of town. It was the best dollar she ever spent. We hope the story of Alma Prescott has brought a little warmth and inspiration to your evening. Her story reminds us that value is often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a patient hand and a clear eye. Before you go, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it. And we'll leave you with a question to ponder. What in your own life might be a cursed house, an overlooked place, or a forgotten skill that holds a hidden value, just waiting for you to open the door? Thank you for being with us.